Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. One of my favorite parts of being a game master is world building. Today, I return to my very popular series of world building episodes, and I think this will be a very interesting episode for you because today I'm going back to the drawing board. Hello, listener. Greetings, fellow GM and or player. Welcome to Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and I'm transmitting to you today from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside time and space. I've got the monolith parked beside a beautiful nebula today, but I found myself thinking about my D&D world, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from listeners who are really digging the world building episode. I've had lots of people ask me, when are you doing another world building episode? And it has been a while. Looking back over my schedule, my last world building episode was episode 36, way back in season 2 of the show. So it's been a while since I've talked about world building. And to answer the question, why? To be honest, I have not, until very recently, spent any time or thought on my D&D world. As you know, I was running Tyranny of Dragons in D&D and running that in the stock setting of Forgotten Realms, so really didn't need to do much world building there. And I recently moved and was very busy with that, and I've been busy running a couple Star Wars campaigns and just been busy with gaming stuff and non-gaming stuff, and just haven't had really time or energy to think about my D&D world. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of what I've been doing with my world lately, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about this kind of back and forth that I go through with myself over a D&D campaign world. And I'm curious if any of you have similar thoughts or conflicts within yourselves. On the one side of the conflict, I have, I've never really built my own world from the ground up. When I used to run D&D back in the second edition days, I ran in Forgotten Realms. Now, granted, I did take many, many liberties with Forgotten Realms and did a lot to kind of make it my own, but it was still, at the end of the day, it was Forgotten Realms with many of the locations and characters that you would recognize. And third edition, same thing. When I ran Pathfinder, I ran in Galarian, which is the stock Pathfinder setting. And since I've been running 5th edition, I've done primarily published stuff, and it's all been in Forgotten Realms. So there's always been this part of me that's always felt like, in a way, I'm not a real dungeon master, because, it seems like something that separates the men from the boys among dungeon masters, if you'll forgive the saying, is building and running in your own campaign world, right? There's like this feeling in the hobby, and maybe this is kind of an old school thing. Maybe it's not like this so much anymore, and I'm just out of touch because I'm old or getting there. But to me, it's always seemed like, to really be taken seriously as a dungeon master or a game master, you kind of need your own homebrew world, like all the cool dungeon masters have them, right? All the cool game masters have their own settings. And I guess in a way, maybe I'm more talking about D&D here than other games, or, the various D&D clones, where this is the common thing. I mean, if you're running Star Wars, you're probably running in something resembling the canon Star Wars setting, right? You're not creating your own galaxy for Star Wars, probably. Although some people might be, but I wouldn't say that that's the norm, right? If you're playing Numenera, you're most likely playing in your own version of the Ninth World, right? So in other games, maybe we don't so much have this tendency to want to create your own setting, but throughout the history of D&D, at least since I've been involved with it, that is very much a part of it. And at least back in the day, it seemed like for every DM you'd find who's running in Dark Sun or Dragonlance or Ravenloft, you'd find a DM who's running in his own world of his own creation. So on the one side, I feel like I kind of should make my own world, that I should take off the training wheels, go swim in the deep end, whatever analogy you want to use, or metaphor, I should say, and just go for it, right? And I'm a fairly creative person. I like writing, I like world building, I like coming up with stuff. So it seems like a natural fit, right? But on the other side, there's the fact that building your own world, especially if you're going to try to do it with a level of completeness and attention to detail like you see in published settings, like the various iterations of the Forgotten Realms setting that have been published, Dragonlance setting, Glorantha, etc., etc., etc. You look at any campaign setting book and it's just filled with stuff. And if you're thinking as a GM, I've got to do that, like that's a lot of work. That is a lot of work. And even if you're going to do the thing of starting really small and kind of building out, it's still a lot of work. So it's kind of difficult to face this mountain of work ahead of you and not have at least part of yourself say, well, I could probably save myself a lot of time and a lot of effort by finding a really good published setting that I can use and then just tweaking that to be what I want. Why reinvent the wheel? Why build a setting from the ground up and come up with histories and countries and races and pantheons and all this stuff when or if I can find a setting I really like that's already done and then just make it my own. So that's kind of the conflict. And since 5th edition has come out, I found myself on both ends of the conflict and everywhere in between. Like it just any day of the week, I might fall on another part of that spectrum, right? It's like some days I'm all fired up to just build my world and do everything my own, do everything unique. And I'm also excited about bringing my players into that process more than I ever did in the past, at least, and giving the players some agency to create and define things within the world. Like, I think that's really cool. And I think it's really cool to be able to just come up with stuff. When a player asks about the relationships between one country or another, or one guild and another, or whatever, instead of having to go flip through a bunch of books and try to find the answer, or go online and try to find the answer, to instead have the freedom to, as a group, right then and there, decide what is the answer and what's the coolest answer we can come up with, right? So that's really appealing. But again, on the other side, it's kind of nice to have it all done for you if maybe you don't want to take the time to do that, or just no good ideas are coming to you or your group. So I've gone back and forth, and I talked about on a recent episode how I was losing steam with Tyranny of Dragons and how my group had a discussion about it, and we decided to play Star Wars for a little bit. So we're doing Edge of the Empire. I'm running them through the published adventure Beyond the Rim. And, that's kind of what we're doing right now. But I've been thinking, well, what am I going to do next, right? What's coming next? Because I like to plan and prepare for things, both just mentally and actually, preparing things. And I was sick a day this week, so I took the day off and just spent the day, being sick. So I had a lot of time to think, and I spent a lot of that time thinking about, what I want to do with these games I'm running and what I want to do in the future, what games I want to run in the future. And I thought about, I've got this group on Thursday. It's a great group. And, we're doing this kind of break in Star Wars, but I don't know that I want to keep this group in Star Wars because I'm running another Star Wars campaign. And so far, I just haven't noticed any of the players like really getting engaged with the Star Wars game, Edge of the Empire. So I'm thinking, well, maybe try something else, right? And I realized I was like, I'm really digging 5th edition. And I really feel like I still haven't seen play above like 8th level. I haven't seen, the higher levels of the game. How does that shake out compared to 2nd edition or 3rd edition or Pathfinder? Like, Have we found a way to resolve all the problems that happen with higher level play, or are those problems still there? And also, kind of the jury's still out for me with the Star Wars system, because there are things I really like about it. Like, I really like the character creation, or I always want to say I like the character creation, and actually I don't particularly like the character creation, especially for a new player. It's kind of rough. But what I do like is the character development. I like that you can build a character, and as you play that character, there's so many different directions you can go, and at any time you can totally change direction if you want and do something totally different. And the things that you did before will still be a benefit to you, right? You can grab a specialization from a totally different career. You can decide suddenly that you're a Force user now, or whatever. And you compare that with a game like D&D, or even a game like Numenera, where character development is very linear. In D&D, you make a character, you pick your class, and then either first or second or maybe third level, it varies for the different classes, you pick your archetype or your specialization within that class. And then you're kind of locked in on this linear progression, and you can sit there at first level and look at the chart for your class and see all the abilities you're going to get through your career. Now, granted, if you're a spellcaster, then you have your spells you pick, which are going to affect your character. If you're a character like I think it's called the Battle Master fighter archetype, you have different moves and abilities you can choose as you level. Same thing with rogues. So it's not like every 20th level fighter is going to be the same, right? But if you compare that with what you can do in the Star Wars systems, there's a lot less room, to change your character or go different directions. In D&D, pretty much there's multi-classing. And multi-classing has some really strong inherent drawbacks with it. And Numenera is kind of the same way. As you tier up, you can choose from different type abilities, but all your focus abilities are set. Your descriptor usually doesn't change, so it's like you kind of choose this trajectory for your character at character creation, and you're kind of stuck with that. And that's how a lot of games are. So I really like Star Wars in that it gets away from that, and there's so many options, almost too many options as a player. But where the jury is still out for me is in the actual system and running it as a GM. Now, I'm saying the jury's out because I still want to get more proficiency with the system before I decide the final verdict. But so far, I found it, much rougher to run than Numenera or 5th edition D&D. There's a lot more little crunchy fiddly bits. It's like I can run an adventure for Numenera completely on the fly. I could do the same thing with D&D. Now, D&D, I might worry a little bit about an encounter, but, I can have some guidelines where I can just throw an encounter together and it's a snap. And I actually prefer D&D system to Numenera's because I can actually make balanced encounters, where Numenera is just kind of like you just hope that the thing works the way you think it will, because there's really nothing in the system to enable you to create a balanced encounter. You're just kind of shooting blind. But those are, two systems that are really easy to run on the fly. Star Wars is much less so. You really need to do some homework before you run a Star Wars campaign if you don't want things to come to a grinding halt, especially if you're going to have anything involving vehicles or starships in combat. Because I think I've talked about on the show before about how the game's very poorly organized. So if you're going to have your players encounter a Star Destroyer, well, first of all, you're not going to find stats for a Star Destroyer in the Edge of the Empire book. You have to go hunt them down in another book, which you have to pay too much money for, but that's a whole nother topic. But let's say you had stats for a Star Destroyer and you're playing Edge of the Empire. Well, that's not enough, because you also need stats for the various crew members that are going to be relevant. If you're going to have the Star Destroyer shooting at the PCs, then you need to know what kind of stats the gunners have. What's their dice pool for gunnery. And that is not anywhere near the stats for the Star Destroyer in whatever book you can find it in. So not only are you probably going to have two separate books open, even if you had them in the same book, like you're using a ship from the core book and NPCs from the core book, they're going to be in two very different parts of the book. So, if you want to be able to run a space combat smoothly and efficiently, you're going to want to compile that information together somewhere for yourself so that you're not flipping back and forth and getting confused and all this stuff. And that takes prep time, right? So jury's still out on that. All right. So anyway, long story short, I came around to thinking I'd really like to run more D&D. I'd like to see higher level play. I'd like to play with more of the monsters in D&D and see how those work, and legendary actions and lair actions and all this stuff, and just really get a good feel for the system, which is also what I'm trying to do with the Star Wars system right now. So I'd really like to do that. I'm also, as you probably know, I record most of my games that I run online and I put them up on YouTube. When I can, I stream them. Used to stream on Twitch. Lately, I've been streaming on Google Hangouts. I would like to start streaming on YouTube gaming, but unfortunately where I'm living right now, temporarily while I look for a house, my internet sucks. I've got this shitty DSL internet. I feel like I'm back in the 90s, and streaming just does not work from here. I have tried streaming, and if you see my more recent stuff like the Force and Destiny beginner game that I did, and my newest Star Wars campaign that I've been putting up on YouTube, you'll notice that my video quality is really low. My video will freeze, and that's all just because of my shitty internet. So I've decided what I really need to do is I need to record those on my hard drive locally and then upload them to YouTube. And yes, with my shitty internet, it will take literally hours, maybe all night, to upload a video to YouTube. But at least then, once I finally get it up there, they'll be decent quality, right? And since I'm recording it locally and uploading it anyway, I might as well do some editing, which is something I've always wanted to be able to do with my actual plays, is actually do some editing and, cut out the bits at the beginning where we're not even playing the game yet, and cut out when we take breaks and there's non-relevant conversations, and also cut it into maybe like half hour or hour sections, and instead of having like a 3.5 hour video for you to watch. And then if you start halfway or stop halfway, then you got to find your spot again and all that. So I've been wanting to do that, but with the, using the Hangouts, it just automatically goes to YouTube. And especially with the slow internet, it didn't seem like a great idea to instead download it, which will take forever, edit it, and then upload it, which will take forever. But since I need to record locally anyway, I might as well do some editing. So I was thinking, it'd be really great to start something new for the YouTube channel and have this be more edited than the stuff I've done in the past. And I thought, what would be fun? I've been wanting, to build a D&D world since I've been playing D&D, and I've never taken the plunge. I've been wanting to play around more with these kind of newer ideas of giving the players more say in world building and even adventure building and stuff like that. And I've been wanting to experiment with that. And it's like, what would be fun is to start running D&D in my own world that I create as I go. I've got these podcast episodes where I can talk about the creation and world building process and what I'm doing and why. And you can go on YouTube and watch gaming sessions in that setting. You can also watch as players come up with stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. So one thing that's really interesting, anytime you're doing any kind of creative project, whether it's writing something or building a setting for your game, or maybe a book that you're writing, or composing a piece of music, or I imagine other forms of art that I don't really have experience with, is when you're working on something creative like that and you walk away from it for a while, when you come back, you always notice things that you didn't see before. And it usually results in some revisions, right? Sometimes more major than others. So that's what happened to me. I came back to my D&D world. I haven't really done much with it for a couple months. Came back to it, started going through my notes, started thinking about it again. And also now thinking of more of having it like this public thing that's going to be on YouTube that I'm going to share with other people. And I came to realize that there were some things that I was thinking about doing with the world that either just weren't going to work, or I just wasn't as excited about them as I was before. And now looking at them again, I'm like, that idea isn't as good as I thought. And just also trying to make this a better experience for my players, and even making this a better experience for me as a GM and for anyone else who might watch the YouTube videos, listen to these episodes and say, hey, I kind of like where Lex is going with this setting. Instead of taking Forgotten Realms and doing my own thing with that, maybe I'll take, what Lex has come up with and do my own thing with that, which would be awesome. That's great. Steal ideas from everywhere. That's what creative people do, right? So I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. I just kind of on a whim decided to do this because I did a lot of work with my world last night, and I had some time today, and I thought, you know what, let's throw together a recording real quick and just talk about some of the stuff I came up with last night. So I am going to open my notebook for my world, my OneNote notebook here. And I love OneNote. I use OneNote. I used to use it when I was writing novels for world building for that, and I'm using it now for world building for RPGs, and I love it. It's a great way to keep a bunch of random yet related stuff together in an organized fashion. And I love that it syncs with my phone. So if I'm out and about and I can't remember something I came up with, I can pull it up. I don't really write on my phone. I mean, that's pretty terrible experience on a touch screen, but so let me pull that up. All right, so one problem that I had going back to the drawing board on my world, looking at what I'd come up with and kind of critiquing it and looking for problems. One problem that I had is I feel like there's too many restrictions on players, and I feel like I'm making too many changes to just the basic how D&D works, right? I'm gonna let you in on a little secret here. I never really played in Greyhawk. I mean, I think when I first started D&D, I might have played a few sessions here and there of first edition Dungeons and Dragons, and those were in Greyhawk, but they were just sessions here and there. I never really played in a campaign set in Greyhawk, so what little I know about Greyhawk, the setting, I know from reading about it online and stuff. I don't know really anything about Greyhawk from actually playing or running in it. The same thing with Mystara. And I could be wrong, but if you were to ask me, what are the original kind of vanilla campaign settings for D&D, I would say Mystara and Greyhawk. Like, that's my understanding, and I could be wrong. But it doesn't really matter because I don't have any experience with any of those. What little I know about Mystara and Greyhawk, I know from doing research mainly online to find out more about them. I never played or ran in either of those worlds. However, as I was kind of brainstorming all these ideas for my world and kind of thinking of high concept, like I want to start with the high concept of the world. Like, what does this world mean? Like, what makes this world different from every other fantasy setting out there, right? Start from there and then kind of drill down to more specific stuff. So as I'm thinking about this, I thought of doing all these different crazy things. Like I talked about before, I was running with the idea of making religions mystery cults and kind of changing a little bit how clerics interact with their gods and just how religion works in the setting and all this stuff, which I still think those are cool ideas. And, maybe something that I play with or I add to my world later. But for now, that's one of the ideas or suite of ideas that I'm kind of putting on the back shelf. I'm like, I'm not going to do that right now. And the reason is I came to realize, I never played in Greyhawk. I never played in Mystara. My first D&D campaign setting that I played in was Dragonlance. And then Forgotten Realms, Dark Sun, Ravenloft. So those are the campaign settings in D&D that I have personal experience with. And I think if you asked a lot of, especially old time gamers, of, what's the stock D&D setting or what of all the published settings do you think is the most like just generic, or I don't know, generic has a bad connotation, but like this is D&D, right? Without any alterations or changes. This is just straight up D&D. people might say Greyhawk, they might say Mystara, they might say something else, but I don't think anyone's going to say Dark Sun. I don't think anyone's going to say Ravenloft. I don't think many people would even say Forgotten Realms. And that's one of the criticisms I've heard so often about Forgotten Realms is, well, it's, they've changed too many things from what D&D is, and it doesn't feel like D&D. It feels like something else. And you can say the same things about Dark Sun, Ravenloft. All these are settings that have different things to them. Like Ravenloft is more horror, and Dark Sun is more kind of gritty and survivalist and stuff like that. So I came to realize, I've never played or run in a more kind of straight up D&D setting. And in my mind, in my imagination, that has like this mystique to it, right? Like I always kind of wanted to play in a setting like that. And I never got that opportunity. So I thought, that's what I want to do with my world. I want to make again, that word generic, I just can't think of a better word, but a vanilla, let's say vanilla D&D setting, or what I imagine one to be. Because again, I don't really have any real experience. And it could be that my imaginings of a vanilla D&D setting won't be vanilla at all, right? But the other thing I'm thinking is, if I'm going to be running this online, I could be running with players. I don't know. I've never played before. I may start running D&D in local game stores. And if I do that, I'm going to be running for players I don't know, have never gamed with before. So when you're in a situation like that, it's much easier to say, make a character and just go by what's in the player's handbook and you're good, right? Than to say, here's a four pieces of paper with all the changes to races and classes and character creation and everything else, how clerics work and how deities work and how magic works in my world, right? I've made all these changes. So you need to, keep all this in mind when you make a character, right? Now, when you're running for friends that you've gamed with forever, that's not a big deal, right? But when you're running for strangers and maybe you're just going to do a one shot and you're never going to see these people again, it's kind of a lot to chew, right? And I thought, I really like what's in the monster manual, what I've read of it. I really like what's in the player's handbook. And I want to make a world where you don't need to change anything, right? If you want to play an elf, if you want to play a dark elf in my world, you can flip to dark elf in the player's handbook. You can make your character and everything's going to work the way that works mechanically. As far as who the dark elves are and what they're like, all that's going to work. The only thing that might need changed is place names, right? If there's any place names, because we're not in Faerun. So I thought that would make it easy for players. And also, if you remember when I talked about races, there are certain races that just I don't like. Like, I don't like gnomes. I think gnomes are pointless. I don't see, how a gnome is different enough from an elf or a halfling to be its own other thing. I feel like we could have made halflings more interesting and made elves a little more interesting, and then we wouldn't have needed gnomes at all, right? But what if I have a player come to my table who loves gnomes? Do I really want to tell that player, I'm sorry, you can't play a gnome because I don't have gnomes in my world because I don't like gnomes? I mean, I could do that, right? But I might lose that player. Maybe that player just really wanted to play a gnome and he doesn't want to play something else. And even if I don't lose the player, I do lose an opportunity there, right? So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say there are no limits to races. All the races are there. All the races in the player's handbook are available to play. I'm not going to have all these races that you can't play like I was originally going to do. And that might have been what started this whole kind of revising what I'd come up with was I don't like limiting players any more than I have to. And I'm like, wow, I'm removing race options from the game. And then I'm going to try to make up for that by coming up with more sub races for the races that I'm keeping in. First of all, that seems like a lot of work that I probably don't need to do. I could spend doing other things. And second of all, like, I don't know. Why do that to yourself? Why basically rip pages out of the player's handbook and say, well, we can't use these in my world, right? So now the idea is I still don't like gnomes, and I'm not really going to spend a lot of time coming up with how gnomes fit into my world because I'd rather spend time working on things I like. So I just, the gnomes are in the gray mist. It's undefined other than what's in the player's handbook as far as, what gnome culture is like and what gnomes are like and stuff. So if I have that player who's like, man, I really want to play a gnome, first of all, I can say, yes, you absolutely can play a gnome. And second, I can say, and because you are the first player to really play a gnome in my world, and because I as a DM am not really in the gnomes and haven't really come up with much about the gnomes, you kind of have more free reign to define things yourself for what a gnome is or how gnomes behave or how people think about gnomes and stuff like that. Now, I want you to stay within what's in the player's handbook because, again, I don't want to change what's in the player's handbook. I'm happy to add to it, but I don't want to change what's there because if I have a new player that's read about gnomes in the player's handbook, I don't want to be like, well, all those things you read about gnomes are wrong. This is how gnomes work in my world. If I have a player that wants to do something that outside of the box with gnomes, I would just come up with a new subrace for the gnome and say, okay, let's create a new type of gnome that's this thing that you want to do. So we're not messing with the gnomes in the player's handbook. And then I'm adding something, right? I'm adding a subrace. I'm not monkeying with what's already there. But I think that would be pretty cool for that player. I really like elves. And if I was playing for a DM who just wasn't into elves and he was like, yeah, I haven't really done much with elves in my world, but since you're really into them and you want to play one, feel free to come up with, as much elf stuff as you want. Just, run it by me first. That'd be awesome. I'd probably end up giving that DM way more information than he would ever want about elves, right? So I think that could be cool. Or if I have a player that really likes dwarves, and that's going to be possible with any race, because I really want the players to have some ownership in this world and be able to bring their ideas to the table. Now I get to have, I'm like the director of the movie, so I get to have final say on what stays and what gets cut and what's a good idea and what needs more work. But I'm going to try very hard to work with the players. And, even if I can't use an idea that they have exactly as presented, figuring out a way that we can make that idea work in such a way that we're both happy with how it fits into the world, right? So that's the goal. So in creating this world, not only am I trying to come up with a cool world with cool ideas that make me excited, I'm also thinking about the players and the GMs, which right now the GM is myself, but who knows, other people may use this stuff in the future, and then I'm thinking about those GMs. So my players, I don't want to limit options. Any option in the player's handbook they can use. I'm also so far cool with everything official in final form that Wizards has put out. I'm not going to use playtest stuff because I'm not playtesting here. So if people want to do psionics, it's well, let's wait for something official and finalized to come out for that, and then we'll decide what we're going to do with psionics in the world. But as far as stuff that isn't Unearthed Arcana or stuff like that they've put up for playtesting, but things that are released, like for instance, the Elemental Evil Player's Companion or whatever it's called. If people want to play a Genasi, that's fine. That's fine. If people want to use spells from there, that's fine. That's awesome. So no limitations as far as that goes with the PCs. And at least for the first campaign I run, I'm not even going to put limitations, that you might put within there, like saying no dark elves. Right? I'm fine with people playing dark elves. And if everybody wants to play a dark elf, then I guess maybe we're doing an Underdark campaign. I don't know. But I'm also thinking about the GM and trying to think of ideas of how to make things in the world that make it easier for the GM or the DM, I guess I should say, to run the game, right? So one thing that Pathfinder does that I really like, and I really think it's cool, I know I've mentioned it more than once on the show, is they have the Pathfinder Society. I think the Pathfinder Society is a brilliant idea. And by Pathfinder Society, I'm not talking about the organized play in the real world of Pathfinder. I'm talking about the in-Galarian setting organization called the Pathfinder Society, which are basically adventurers. But Paizo went ahead and say, hey, let's take this thing adventuring that obviously is something that people do in all the D&D settings because that's what the player characters are. And let's actually codify that as not only an actual thing that people do, but as an actual organization called the Pathfinders, which I thought was a really cool idea and can really help, in your first session of a new campaign of figuring out why all these people work together because, well, maybe they're all Pathfinders, right? Makes perfect sense. So I wanted to do something like that in my game. I wanted to have an adventure be an actual thing in game or in the world, in the setting that's like a real thing, So I've been playing Witcher 3 a lot lately and having a lot of fun with it. And one of the things that I like about Witcher 3 is it's basically like Supernatural in a fantasy setting. And by Supernatural, I mean the TV show where the main characters hunt monsters. And it's in modern day, and the conceit of the show is basically any monster you've ever heard about is or was a real thing. And these guys go around killing them. Vampires, zombies, ghouls, dragons, old gods, like you name it, they've covered it. And The Witcher's like that, only in a fantasy setting. And the Witchers are people who have been modified by magic, and so they have some superhuman or supernatural abilities, and they just roam the countryside and slay monsters. So I really like that. I also like how in the Witcher games, how the people kind of relate to Witchers. Most people would say, if you need a monster killed, a Witcher is the person to do it for you. They're really good at that. And that way they protect us from, these scary things out in the world that would eat us and rip us to pieces. But at the same time, people don't trust Witchers. They don't necessarily like Witchers. They're afraid of them because they use magic and they're not completely human anymore and all this stuff. So there's a lot of prejudice and fear directed at them as well. I think that's kind of fun. Now, obviously, in a fantasy game, in a D&D game, kind of a main character in the world is magic itself. And as part of the high concept of my world, thinking about the high concept, I wanted to think about how magic interacts with the world. And, I did my episode. It was the first world building episode. Let's see, what was it called? Brainstorming Big Picture Ideas, I believe. Oh, just big picture. I trimmed it down. So episode 28, world building number 1, big picture. I talked a lot about the deities, right? And how the gods work. I think a lot of that I'm going to keep. I'm kind of putting the mystery cult thing on the back burner. That's something I may still do in the future, but that's going to involve a lot of mechanical stuff that I don't want to mess with right now. I want to get this thing up and running so we can play games and have fun in this setting. And also I'm trying to keep it as vanilla D&D as I can. So a player can take what's in the player's handbook and run with it. A DM can take what's in the monster manual and run with it. And you don't have to worry about, is this different in this world? Because it won't be. So as far as pantheons, deities, I've got a lot of groundwork laid there. But magic, how does magic work in the world? And right away I came up with this idea of the world is very, very old. And yeah, that's a total cliche in fantasy. I mean, every fantasy world is very, very old. But my idea is this world is even older than that. Like, this world is just unimaginably old. And I don't want to try to, mash together science fiction and fantasy too much. But just as a springboard of ideas, I thought of this world existing closer to the center of its galaxy. So in the night sky, there's a lot more stars. There's nebulas that can be seen with the naked eye, things like that. I'm thinking the world is in a binary star system. I'm thinking that it might even have a red giant and a blue giant as binary stars. So we can have this big red sun and this big blue sun in the sky. It's going to have multiple moons. And the idea is that magic is very powerful here. The world is very old. Maybe it's one of the first worlds ever. And obviously in D&D, we're not concerned about astrophysics and we're not flying from planet to planet. We're traveling magically through planes. But I'm still kind of using the astronomy as a source for cool ideas of, oh, it never really gets dark here because there's so much light in the sky at night. And oh, there's aurora borealis going on almost all the time at night because there's a lot more stellar radiation bouncing off the atmosphere than we would have on Earth. And people see these lights in the sky as the physical, visible manifestation of magic in the world, which in a fantasy sense, it pretty much is. And the idea that this is one of the first worlds, it's very, very old, every civilization in the world is built on the bones of countless other civilizations that have come and gone. And I'm also kind of pulling a little bit from the Ninth World, from Numenera here, which is very much inspired by Gene Wolfe's writings. And I like the idea of very deep time. I like the idea of many strange wonders being in the world, like floating mountains and all kinds of weird things floating in the sky and old ruins and old magics and all this stuff. But in the Ninth World, where all this weirdness is explained through technology, in my D&D world, it's explained through magic. Kind of same thing, just a different skin on it, right? Now, one of my ideas is that not only is this world a very magical place and very old and all that, but it's also at a kind of planar nexus, because this is fantasy, we can just make shit up, right? So for whatever reason, maybe it's because it has two huge suns and there's a lot of gravity involved, if we want a more sci-fi explanation for things. But for whatever reason, this world is kind of a planar hotspot. So my idea here is that, as you know, when you do things like teleport or planar travel, there's oftentimes a chance that something goes wrong, right? And when something goes wrong, you end up in some random place on some random plane, right? So when this happens, for whatever reason, it is more likely that you will end up on my world than anywhere else in the multiverse. So throughout this very, very long history of this world, it has had many, many visitors. It has had wizards or other magic using creatures that are planar traveling and have some kind of mishap and they end up there. It's also the site of many portals and gates and rifts to various planes that open and close all the time. Part of the inspiration for this is if you've ever played or heard of the MMO Rifts, which I used to play and really enjoy. In fact, Rift. Rifts is the role-playing game, the tabletop game. Rift, which actually my first podcast was about Rift, through the Rift. One thing that was really cool in that game is you had these rifts that would open up to the different elemental planes and all kinds of stuff would come through them, and your characters in the game had to seal them so that things would stop coming out. So I'm going to have something similar to that in my world where, for whatever reason, gates and rips in reality and stuff happen more often here. So one of the fun results of that's going to make running in this world a lot of fun for me as a DM and anyone else that wants to use it is, first of all, you can use monsters like devils, demons, any kind of elementals, undead, any kind of aberration or outer planar creature that comes from somewhere else, right? You can use that stuff a lot more, and you don't really have to explain it, right? You can also use monsters from any other setting or game that you want. So if you're playing some other RPG, like, I don't know, maybe Numenera, or you're playing the Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game, or any role-playing game, and there's some creature in there that you really, really like, you can just put it whole cloth into my world, and it makes sense. It's like, well, it fell through a planar gate or a planar tear and ended up here, because that's what happens on this world. And so because of that, it's very easy as a DM to kind of throw whatever you want at your players, especially if it's something like an aberration or something extra planar. It can kind of show up anywhere, and it could come through a portal or a tear that's still active and open, and maybe the player characters need to go deal with that, or it could be something that was just open briefly and now it's gone, but something has come through. And that came directly out of, me thinking my next D&D campaign, like, what do I want to do? And I was thinking, well, I want to base adventures on encounters, and I want to base encounters on really cool monsters. So whatever the player character level is, I want to look through the monster manual and find the coolest monsters I can find that are appropriate for that level and build encounters around those. And of course, I quickly realized, well, if I'm doing that, I may come up with things that don't really make sense, like weird segues, like, oh, we just fought a desert creature and now we're going to fight an aquatic creature. So I thought, well, I can easily take care of that with downtime, right? It's like, okay, 6 months go by. You guys can figure out what you did for 6 months. But one of the things you did for 6 months is you moved from this desert region you were in and now you're on the coast, right? I can do stuff like that. But then, that's when this idea of planar traveling kicked in. And I thought, okay, so not only can we have all these different things on the world from all history, and the other idea about the world is really big. It's like a super Earth. So it's much, much bigger than Earth. And that way, if I ever want to do a kind of kitchen sink thing where I'm like, oh, I want to have, an area that's inspired by ancient Egypt or whatever, I can like really space those apart so they're not going to interact. And it also leaves me a lot of room to come up with stuff in the future if I want to. And it's just kind of cool. And this idea that the world is very much unexplored. There are these little pockets of civilization here and there, but much of the world is just wild and unexplored with these ruins everywhere. And who knows what you're going to find out there. Weird monsters, all kinds of stuff. So I kind of came up with all these ideas as ways to make it easier for me to kind of do whatever I want and have it make sense. All right, so high concept, I talked about the world is very old. It's had many visitors from countless places, different planes, different prime material plane worlds throughout history. And one of the things about this world is magic is very powerful here. So it's very common for very powerful wizards and other spellcasters to come here to do various magical rituals, because maybe it's easier to do here because magic's more powerful, or maybe they can do rituals here, like maybe like elven high magic or something that they can't do on their homeworld, but they can do it here, right? So because of this, throughout the history of the world, there have been all these powerful spellcasters that come here briefly, do some crazy magic, and then go back to wherever they came from. So in addition to all the usual monsters that you would have, there are also going to be monsters, which I'll come up with, that are creations of these various people that have come and done magic or done experiments or whatever. Another idea I had about the magic is that the magic is so powerful here that it tends to infuse or soak into beings that come from somewhere else. So it's a kind of thing of, you can visit this world from another plane or whatever, and if you stay a very short time, like, you're okay, right? But if you stay for very long, this powerful magical energy that's all around you that you came here probably to exploit is going to actually have a permanent effect on you and change you. So some of the things that exist in the world maybe originally came from another place and then became so altered by the magic here that they either couldn't leave or no longer wanted to. Now, one thing that's always kind of bothered me about D&D is the, what we like to call the Vancian magic. And this has always bothered me because I just thought it was a very kind of contrived way to do magic. And to me, it doesn't really make sense and never did from a conceptual point of view. And I've always been tempted to quote unquote fix the D&D magic system. And I'm not the only one I know who thinks this way, because I've heard other people say similar things. But again, I don't want to fuck with how magic works and say, oh, we're going to use spell points in this world, or we're going to have psionics instead of magic. Because again, I want it to be as stock as I can make it so that, it's not confusing for people who are new to it. So I came up with this idea of, okay, well, we're not going to monkey with magic. Magic is fine, but I'm going to use this very tired cliche again in fantasy of, well, in the olden days, thousands of years ago, people wielded powerful magic that we can only imagine today, right? And this is very standard. This is where artifacts come from, and I very much like the idea of, no one can really make artifacts anymore. The artifacts in the world are left over from long, long ago, and no one really knows how they were made or how they work. And they even seem to interact with magic in a completely different way than modern day magic items, right? And so the idea is that the Vancian magic, the magic as we see it in D&D, is quote unquote modern magic. It's how people use magic now, but it's not how people use magic thousands of years ago, or maybe tens of thousands of years ago, or maybe millions of years ago. People used a more primal and powerful form of magic that has been lost. Like, nobody knows how to do magic like that anymore. And what that does is that allows me as a DM to have this kind of fallback for this old magic that I can use for anything that the plot demands. And the idea behind the old magic is it is not covered by the mechanics and rules of D&D. It exists beyond and outside of that. All of the rules and mechanics in D&D are how the new magic works, and everything fits together great. But if, as the DM, I want something to happen that can't be explained, because, magic can't do that, it's the old magic, because the old magic can do whatever the DM wants it to do. So you could have some creature that was created with the old magic that has very different rules than other D&D creatures, or you could have an item or an artifact created with the old magic that works very differently than anything else in the game, and it totally makes sense. And if it turns out to break the game, the DM can always change it or have it suddenly not work. And again, the old magic is completely within the realm of DM-fy it. It's not something the player characters will ever learn to the degree that they could wield it or use it. It's just there for story purposes to be used by the DM to have really cool things happen, like have a castle that is built on top of the clouds. And unlike, like a cloud giant castle, which would fall if it cruised into a dead magic zone, this doesn't for some reason, and stuff like that. Now, I mentioned how magic kind of suffuses visitors to this world and changes them slowly over time. Well, it does the same thing with the player characters. And this is the reason why the adventurers in my world are kind of set apart from the normal people. The idea is you can't touch magic in this world without it touching you back, right? So anyone who uses magic in any form, whether it's a wizard casting spells, or it's an eldritch knight casting spells, or it's any other character drinking a potion or using a magic item, once you have interacted with magic directly in any way, it's believed that it changes you, that you are no longer entirely what you were before that happened. So the average everyday person has no interaction with magic. They see it in the sky and, what we would call the northern lights. They see manifestations of it in magical creatures that rampage through their villages wreaking destruction. But the average everyday villager or whatever doesn't cast spells, right? Only adventurers do that. And that is what sets them apart from everyone else. It's not that they can swing a sword really well. It's that they've been touched by magic, right? So pretty much any class or archetype in the game has some kind of magical ability or something that could be seen as a magical ability at some point that they get access to. And that's one of the reasons I did this, because magic just seems much more prominent in 5th edition. A fighter, you can be just a plain Jane single class fighter and cast spells as an Eldritch Knight. Same thing with a rogue. Where in previous editions of the game, if you were a fighter or a rogue, you had to multi-class or take a prestige class or something like that to have magical abilities. Where now pretty much any, I think, character in D&D can have magical abilities, at least if they pick the right archetype, right? But even if there could be or would be a character that doesn't have any magical abilities, they will still be touched by magic. And this will take the form of various boons that I, as a DM, will award to characters as they advance. So we have in the DMG, we have various boons and magical boons that PCs can get. Some of these can come from deities. Some of these can come from the Fae. I don't remember what all the sources of them are. And we're given quite a few examples. So all that's possible in my world. But in addition, you could get some kind of magical boon that wasn't given to you by a conscious entity like a deity or a Fae, but is just the result of your exposure to the magic around you and how it's gradually changing you. And, you know, I get the feeling from reading the DMG that the intent is these boons are kind of more of a high level thing that you get, right? Usually. But in my world, you know, this is going to start happening right away. Like even within the first few levels, player characters may get some kind of magical boon. Now, obviously, ones I hand out at second level aren't going to be like game breaking things, right? It could be as simple as once per day, you get advantage on this particular type of action or whatever. You know, or it could be some kind of magical bonus or whatever. And that's going to be completely up to me to come up with what those are. Obviously, I'll try to find things that fit the character and the story and make sense how this ability developed. But it's just going to be a way to kind of add another form of character advancement and character specialization and differentiation for player characters, and also a way to show how they are different from normal people. Even if they're not a magic user, or even if they don't use magic items, they still in some way are interacting with magic as an adventurer, and that's what makes them different, at least in the minds of people, right? This may or may not really be true, but I guess it is, because mechanically I'm reflecting it with the boons, right? So I've got some cool high concept ideas, right? I'm going to be using lots of extraplanar monsters and undead and aberrations and stuff like that. Just going to have lots of fun with those things. Players are going to have access to any race or class that's in the game that they want to play. Got all this history that can be discovered. And basically, I've set a stage where I can kind of do anything I want as a DM, and it will be really easy to explain how and why that's happening and have it make sense in the setting, right? So I feel like at this point, I've kind of got the big picture. Like I'm kind of good with it, right? Like I don't need to come up with a 30,000 year timeline of everything that happened, because none of that matters. Now, I do want to do some more work with pantheons, especially if I have any characters that are paladins or clerics, you know, going to need to know that. But I've already done a lot of that groundwork already, so I'll just use that. So really, I feel like the next step in my world building is start thinking about the first adventure, right? So I'm not going to sit here and draw maps of countries and cities and all this stuff, because I don't need any of that, right? I mean, I could easily spend 10 years building this world and never run a game in it, you know, trying to get everything ready, but that's not what I want to do. I'm not writing a world guide to publish and sell to people, right? I'm creating a world for me to run games in with my players. So the sooner I can be ready to launch the game, the better. So at this point, what I'm going to start thinking about is my first adventure and where that's going to take place. So I already mentioned that I'm basically looking through the monster manual, looking for really cool monsters to throw at the PCs that'll make really cool thematic set piece encounters. Then I'm going to build a story around the monsters I pick so that it makes some degree of sense. And this is very different from how I've designed adventures in the past. Before, I always tried to come up with a story and then went from there. But, you know, D&D is all about the encounters. So I want to start with really cool encounters and go from there. So I've decided I'm going to start my players at second level, because the transition from first to second level is pretty boring. There's not a lot that happens there. And at second level, most or all of the classes have been able to pick their archetype. So it's like you are what you are at that point, you know? And first level characters are really fragile. And going by the guidelines, the most powerful monster I should throw at a group of first level characters is a CR1, right? because if I throw a CR2 at first level characters, there's a very good chance that it can one-shot one of them, especially depending what CR2 I pick. And when you go through the list of CR1 creatures, which, by the way, why is this in the DMG and not in the monster manual? But anyway, when you go through the list of CR1 creatures, there weren't very many or any that really grabbed me as like kind of like a boss encounter, right? So I look at the CR2 list and there's some really cool possibilities there. So I decided I'm going to start the players at level 2, looking at how the XP breaks down. I can do in the ballpark of around 5 CR2 encounters before they will have earned enough XP to get to 3rd level. So I'm going to go through, I made a short list of the coolest CR2 creatures, and then I'm going to start whittling that down to 5 or less and build encounters around them, and always looking for creatures that work well together, right? So that's kind of my game plan for coming up with the first adventure. And once I've got that down, then I come up with a place for this to happen. And I'm thinking, just to make the world building a little easier on myself, I'm going to start in a fairly remote village or town. I kind of drew a rough map already of where I want to start. I've got a huge forest nearby. It's a few days to the next nearest village or whatever. And then the closest big city is, I think, a week or so away towards the coast. So I kind of have my beginning area as far as that goes kind of set. But once I know what I'm doing for an adventure, I know what kind of locations I'll need, and I can start fleshing out this beginning town. But again, I want to start with just what I need for that first adventure, and then just play it by ear, see what the players want to do, where they want to go, and just build the world as needed, and always looking for input and cool ideas from my players. So probably in the next world building episode, I'll probably start talking about coming up with that first adventure, what some of the monsters are that I'm picking, and how I'm going from a list of cool monsters to a list of cool encounters to a story that makes it all make sense to a place for all these cool things to happen. All right, well, I think that is good for our 5th world building episode 57 of Game Master's Journey. If you have any comments or feedback or ideas or questions or anything, I would love to hear from you. Please email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker, and follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please visit the website starwalkerstudios.com and check out the show notes for this and all the episodes. Lots of great information in the show notes and helpful links. At the top, you can find the Patreon and donate buttons if you'd like to become a patron or support the show by making a donation. Also, iTunes and Stitcher buttons if you'd like to subscribe to the show there and or leave a review. At the bottom of the show notes, you can find a link to the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community, and I really strongly suggest and request that you join the community there. Not only will you get updates on the podcast and what's going on with Game Master's Journey, but it's also a great place to share any gaming resources that you have, or just have conversations with other gamers. Starwalker Studios also now is doing a monthly newsletter, and you can sign up for that at the bottom of the show notes, and I'll send out an email once a month just letting you know what's going on with all the various Starwalker Studios podcasts. Also, you'll find a link to my YouTube channel where you can check out my actual play videos, a link to a free 30-day trial of Audible books courtesy of Game Master's Journey, and you get a free book with that trial. And that's a great way to support the show. And finally, my Amazon referral link. And I have had some questions recently about how that works. And just real quickly, I'm not a guru on all the ins and outs of the Amazon referral links, but my understanding of how that works is you click on that link, it will take you to Amazon. A lot of times I'll link specific products like in the show notes of an episode, so that'll take you to that product page. I believe the one at the bottom of the show notes just takes you to some Amazon landing page. But all you do is click on one of those referral links. It takes you to Amazon, and then you can buy whatever you want. And I will get kind of a little kickback because you used that referral link. So you can go into your wish list and add stuff to your cart or shop or whatever you need to do. I've had people ask how it works with like tabbed browsing and stuff like that, and I don't really know all of the nitty-gritty details as far as that. I don't know if opening products in another tab is going to mess with that or not. I would think not. I would hope not. But I don't know. But I do appreciate you using the link. It does help out. Also, at the website at starwalkerstudios.com, you can find my other podcasts. Currently, we're producing Beer Tasters, where Nikki and I try a couple craft beers and talk about them. And we're also producing Expanse, the unofficial podcast, which is a fan show devoted to the upcoming sci-fi TV series, The Expanse, which is launching in December. But we're podcasting now, and we do that once a week, and we talk about the show. It is a spoiler-free podcast. We've read the books, but we are not going to spoil the TV show for you in the podcast. So if you're interested in The Expanse, definitely check that out. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. And if you've never built your own world, I hope, like me, that you'll consider trying it. And again, I'd love to hear feedback from you, what you think of these world building episodes. I was a little unsure when I first started doing them how they would be received, but I've heard from quite a few people that really like them, and I always have people asking me, when's the next world building episode coming? So as of now, I'm planning to do more of them. And again, I'm going to be running PCs in this world, and I'm going to be putting videos of that on YouTube. So I'll definitely let you know when those start becoming available. And I think that could be a really great resource too for people to see us actually playing in the world. It's like you get to hear all the theory on the podcast, and then you can go over to YouTube and see the practical application of it. And you can also see the ideas that the players come up with, which I'm really excited about and looking forward to myself. So I will be back very soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.